Record a radio show with a surprise guest from the dead.
Recoil when a bony, leathery crone seeks quality time with you in a crawl space.
Remember that sometimes it's just best to leave the pancakes.
All this and more weird history, strange science, and the paranormal.
It's a spirited roundup.
It's 12 chilling sets of ghost stories.
It's this week's flashback-fused flagon of Odd Tonic.
Welcome to the parlor. I'm Jennifer.
And I'm Maxwell. Please join us on the settee and in a cup of freshly brewed tea, dear guest. We feel like we haven't seen you in ages.
Well, we haven't.
It's true.
The parlor has been quiet for quite some time.
Yes, and I take complete responsibility.
I blame you too.
Well, good. I'm glad we're all in agreement that I'm to blame. No, seriously, January was chock-a-block with obligations beyond ours here at Odd Tonic, dear guest. And after I closed those out, honestly, I was beyond exhausted and just needed a couple of weeks to rest and regroup.
Well, it's been a bit of a sprint.
Yeah.
Although our first episode didn't launch until last March, we have now been officially working on Odd Tonic for just over a year.
Can you believe that?
No. Well, yes, but no. Which makes this a perfect time to wish you a happy season 2 of Odd Tonic, my love.
Oh, happy season 2 to you, darling. I am so excited for what's in store for us this year. Shall we share some tidbits with our dear guest?
Yes.
Let's do it.
First, in our Odd Tonic Facebook community, we have kicked off our secret Gothic Valentine exchange event, where oddlings from around the world are trading creative, dark, and spooky Valentines, Secret Santa style, but spookier.
So great.
Yeah, we can't wait to see what they come up with, and we'll be sharing the amazing artistic results on our Odd Tonic Facebook page and group.
I am so looking forward to that.
Yes.
Also, in our community for season 2, our dear Jennifer has kicked off a new live video stream version of our very popular Tarot Tuesdays event.
I absolutely love it.
I do too. And dear guest, if you want to get in on the fun, join our Odd Tonic Facebook group and every Tuesday, select one of 3 mystery tarot cards that Jennifer has drawn for the day. That evening, join Jennifer in the parlor via live stream as she reveals what your chosen card is and what it means to you.
Plus, we have news on a slightly grander scale. This year, we'll see the debut of our very first Odd Tonic live show.
Yes.
Details to be announced, but we are thrilled to be taking our show on the road.
This season will also usher in sonic enhancements, bringing a richer, lusher tone from the parlor into your earbuds. Excited? So are we. It's going to be an amazing year. So, let's kick it off right now.
Perhaps ironically, the first episode of our season is a recap and consolidation of our last season 1 event, the 12 Days of Christmas Ghost Stories.
If you haven't had a chance to listen to all 12 days of shows, you're in luck. We've consolidated them all into this singular, super deluxe episode.
And if you did listen to them, know that we've added new commentary and music to the stories for extra paranormal pizzazz. So without further ado, let's begin. Day 1.
Welcome, dear guest, to day 1 of Odd Tonic's 12 Days of Christmas Ghost Stories. For the Victorians, Christmas was the perfect time of year to gather around the warm fireplace and share chilling tales of ghostly visitations. Odd Tonic is carrying on this tradition with a ghost story for every day of the 12 days of Christmas. These stories make for great personal listening or to share with friends as an icebreaker to tell true, unexplained tales of your own. Our story tonight comes from Odd Tonic's new resident writer, A.D. Vaughn. We first became aware of A.D.'s talent for writing when she submitted a few listener stories for our Parlor Stories episodes. We are confident that you will hear more of her work on Odd Tonic in the coming year. So here is another true personal account from Ms. Vaughn. Settle in. Here we go.
This isn't my story, but it's mine to tell. Sometimes a story is too fantastic or unreal to be believed. Sometimes the source of a story isn't one that can be easily trusted. As a natural skeptic, finding belief in the paranormal can take some convincing. This is the story of how I began to believe. I was a latchkey kid growing up. When I was in 5th grade, my mom paid our 15-year-old neighbor, Donna, to keep an eye on me after school. Donna was incredible. A massive Madonna fan with an incredible sense of style, Donna was always the brightest light in the room. In contrast to Donna was her friend Lisa. Lisa was a copycat friend. Anything Donna liked, Lisa suddenly started to obsess over it. When Donna went blonde, Lisa went blonde. Where Donna effortlessly commanded the attention of those around her, Lisa would do and say just about anything to get into the limelight. So when I came home from school and heard Lisa tell a fantastic tale about the party Donna should have gone to and how a Ouija board tried to kill them, I wasn't buying it. The story was very dramatic, with doors that wouldn't open, someone throwing a bowling ball, and a window that wouldn't break. But hearing all of this from Lisa just made it impossible to believe. It was a little too convenient that all of this supposedly happened at the one party Donna didn't go to. So I shoved her story off into a little corner of my mind marked total BS. Fast forward 4 years. I'm a freshman in high school hanging out with friends at some boy's house. This guy was my friend Amy's boyfriend. I didn't like hanging out with him all that much, but I loved going to his house because he had a 20-year-old brother that I was crushing on in a very age-inappropriate way. His name was Jamie, and he looked like Val Kilmer in Real Genius. I was completely obsessed, but also incredibly shy, so I never made eye contact or spoke to him for fear of turning bright red. So there we were. Me, Amy, and a few other kids sitting on the floor trying to decide what we wanted to do for Halloween, while Jamie sat on the couch smoking Marlboro Reds and melting my heart with his little half smile. I don't remember who suggested it, but someone said, "I have a Ouija board. We could use it on Halloween." And like a switch, Jamie's demeanor went from coy and cool to serious and protective older brother. "No, don't ever use a Ouija board." The power of his voice was shocking enough, but what he said next left me completely numb. He told us his Ouija board story. It was the same story Lisa had told 4 years ago. When Jamie was a sophomore and Lisa a freshman, they were 2 of the 10 to 12 kids at a party in an old farmhouse their friend lived in. It wasn't some raging kegger like you see in the movies. It was just a group of friends drinking beer and talking trash like kids do. They had a fire going in the fireplace, and some of the couples were sitting in dark corners doing what teenagers do in dark corners. The kid that lived in the house brought out a Ouija board, and the teens decided to have a little impromptu seance. The seance started simply enough. A couple kids put their hands on the planchette and asked if there were any spirits listening. Soon, the planchette started to move. "Are you moving it?" "No, you are," could be heard from the center of the circle. A conversation began with a spirit, and more kids started to pay attention to what was going on. It wasn't long before all the kids started asking random questions, and their questions got increasingly disrespectful. The spirit started to get annoyed, and the planchette started moving wildly around the board. Then, the kitchen light flickered. The closet door began to rattle. They started to hear banging from all around them. The kids freaked out. They turned on the lights in the living room and the dining room. With the board abandoned in the middle of the floor, they thought it would be over, but the pounding and the flickering continued. Plates in the kitchen started to rattle in the cabinets, and the overhead light in the dining room started to swing like there was an earthquake, but the ground was still. Lisa and a couple other girls huddled together in the corner. People tried to get out of the house, but both the front door and the sliding glass door wouldn't open. Someone saw a bowling bag next to the front door, grabbed the ball out of it, and threw it at the sliding glass door. It bounced off. Eventually, someone picked up the Ouija board and threw it into the fireplace. As the board burned, the house calmed down. The banging stopped. The front door popped open, and the sliding glass door shattered. When Jamie finished telling his story, my friends didn't believe him. How could they? It sounded impossible. And it's not like Jamie wasn't above telling tall tales to mess with his brother. But I looked right into Jamie's piercing blue eyes and I said, Lisa was at that party. You know Lisa? She was my babysitter's best friend. Donna? Yeah. Donna was cool. Yeah. If I had only ever heard that story from Lisa or Jamie, I never would have believed it could be true. But hearing the same story from two people 4 years apart makes me think it had to have really happened. Since then, I've used Ouija boards a few times with varying degrees of success, but I've always remembered that story and how things took a terrifying turn when people stopped being respectful to the spirit they had contacted. All right. Besides the amazing delay in the glass door shattering, I mean, how unique and crazy is that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I've never heard that before. That is really cool.
And it kind of makes sense. And it also displays a lot of power that was just being held in that room.
Yeah. That was amazing.
So besides that, one element that I love in a ghost story is the element of independent confirmation.
Yeah.
Two people who have nothing to gain by telling the story or even know that the other one shared it confirm the same paranormal details. It always gives me goosebumps.
Yeah, it's like a ghost story masquerading as a John Hughes movie. You know, there's a definite paranormal breakfast club thing going on in there that I just love. And you know, Jamie seemed so dreamy that even I started to swoon a little bit, I got to admit. And of course, the story is just so well written, but we expect nothing less from AD. And I think my final thought on this is that this tale is a reminder for all the kids out there: be kind, respectful, and protected during Ouija board experiences.
True.
Right?
True.
Remember, kids, this stuff is real. Tread cautiously and with reverence, or else you're going to have to explain why Carl freaked out and broke the sliding glass window to mom and dad.
So true.
Nobody wants that. Okay, day 2. Tonight's story was discovered on HuffPost.com's article, 12 Terrifying Ghost Stories You Shouldn't Read Alone. This is a story I do not often tell. I promise sincerely that it has scarred me for life, and although I have looked into psychological explanations for what I heard and natural explanations for what occurred, they remain unsatisfactory. When I was a child, I was scared of the dark. I swore to my mother I heard voices in it. They were not evil, but they were not familiar, and so they scared me. It was not uncommon in the middle of the night for me to wake up and hear whispers, as I would call them, when telling my mother about them. She figured they were just bumps in the night and typical kids' nightmare material. I tried often to explain to her that they were more than that they sounded different from one another, the way people's voices do. On some nights, I would get so scared from these whispers that I would sleep in my mom's bed with her. I should add at this point that when walking out into the hall to go to the bathroom, You looked directly down the stairs that would lead you into my living room on the first floor, as my mother's bedroom was on the second floor. On one such night, around Christmas, I awoke and felt the need to relieve myself. I walked out the door and distinctly heard the phrase, "Look." And to my astonishment, a red light, almost like a spotlight, was cast upon the wall at the very bottom of the stairs. The light had no other source. It was by itself, and I was transfixed by it. Being a little kid, and it being only a few days from Christmas, I knew what this light was. It was Santa. How else could he get into my house to know that I was being a good boy? I was so excited, I began walking down the stairs to greet him, picking up my pace after the second step, as it began to creep off the wall and fade into the darkness of my living room. That's when I heard him. A very strong, masculine voice, different from the first and from that of my father's. It said, "Stop. Right now. Go back up those stairs." I listened, turned around, and what happened next, I'm not sure I would believe if someone had told me the same story. As I was reaching the top of the stairs, I heard a very loud crash that sent me running back to my mother's bed, where I jumped straight under the covers and stayed there the whole night. When we woke the next morning, the poinsettia lights my mother had on the banister down the stairs were pulled straight down to the bottom of the stairs, some broken from what seemed like a forceful tear, lying in a single pile. The dry sink in my living room had fallen from the wall. My mother could not explain it. My father was worried that we had been the victims of a home invasion. My sister was crying. There was nothing missing. Nobody had broken in. There did not seem to be any reason that this had happened. And then I saw it. And I kept quiet about it because I was so afraid that I could not force words out of my mouth. There, on the edge of the wooden dry sink, which had been facing up, there were 3 indentations where the finish on the wood had been worn, almost as if in a forceful grip. Something down there had grabbed it and threw it down. That was what the bang was. I do not like to imagine what was waiting downstairs for me that night. And after that day, I never heard a single whisper again, which is sad because, in some ways, I would have liked to thank the man who had stopped me from going down those stairs. This happened when I was 7. I'm 20 years old now, and because of this incident, I am still afraid of the dark, especially shadowy stairwells.
I think the most unsettling thing about this story to me, and maybe this is me putting my own filter on it, is looking back on my own childhood. I feel there are so many foggy memories that just don't make sense, like this story sort of illustrates.
Really?
Well, is everyone's childhood like this?
Well, to be honest, I don't have a memory like this, unless I've completely blocked them out, which is a penchant of mine. But you've had a weird memory like this?
Well, just things that happen looking back. You look back on your childhood and you think, that doesn't seem right, or I still can't explain that as an adult.
Well, now you have to tell us what.
Okay, I'll give one example. I remember one night waking up as a kid. I was probably fairly young, maybe between 5 and 7, and it's nighttime and still pitch black out. And I look out my window, and not in our backyard, but our neighbor adjacent to us, their backyard. And past the fence, a chain link fence, there was like a large bush, and it looked like there was glowing eyes in it. Like looking at me.
Like the ever-popular paranormal glowing red eyes?
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah. And, young enough to be like, wow, that's scary. And also too young to be like, what could that be? So I just kind of shut the drapes, put my head under the covers. And I told myself, I got to look out the window when it's daylight to see what is that really.
Right.
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 And I did forget to do that. But a couple of times while playing in the backyard, I would remember and I look and like couldn't quite get the right angle. I'm like, no, I'm not seeing what it could have been. And then finally that same summer, I did manage to remember to look out my bedroom window during the day, and there was nothing there. There was no
shrub,
no shrubbery, no hint that a shrub had been there. There's not like
a stump
or dirt or anything. It was just perfect lawn. There's nothing there that could have explained what it was I saw.
Wow, I love it.
And then, like, what do? No one's going to believe you, Yeah.
Yeah, that's the problem.
You can't figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah. Because you're a kid, you don't have the experience and the perspective to sort of put that together,
And articulate it.
Right. And then parents never listen to you.
No.
Well, like I said, I don't have any sort of memories like that. I think the thing that really was making me wonder about this story was the angry spirit, that was wreaking physical vengeance on the home because his luring of the boy was foiled. Why do you think that was? What was going to happen to that kid?
I don't know.
Well, I have a theory.
Okay.
I think that the Good Samaritan spirit completely wrecked what would have been the last object required for an astral scavenger hunt. This boy, right? The luring spirit was just one kidnapped mortal away from like an all expenses paid trip to Elysian fields. And this Samaritan ghost just ruined it. I'd be upset too.
You'd smash the sink too.
Oh, yeah.
The paranormal equivalent of flipping the table. I'm out.
Absolutely. Warranted, I think. Anyway, here we go. Day 3.
This evening's story comes to us from the book Phantom Messages by William J. Hall and Jimmy Pentonito. Here we go. At age 13, Jolie's grandmother was living with the family due to complications from diabetes. One morning, Jolie was getting ready for school as usual. She ate breakfast and then went to hug her grandmother as she always did before leaving for school. Grandma was not feeling well, but made a smile for her lovely granddaughter. She said, "I love you. Don't ever forget that." Her alarm clock was going off, and she didn't want to go downstairs to turn it off, so she asked Jolie to do that for her. She did. During the morning break at school, Jolie had a feeling that her grandmother had died. When she left school to catch the bus, her dad was waiting for her. He said the words she feared the most. Grandma passed away. She was only 52 years old. Jolie moved downstairs into her grandma's room. She had always had a feeling of comfort and safety in that room, especially when missing her grandmother. Jolie left Grandma's unplugged digital clock on the dresser in her room as a token of remembrance. As the first Christmas without Grandma was approaching, Jolie was missing her and thought about her often. After coming home from seeing a movie with friends, she started on her homework and then went to bed around 2 a.m. Suddenly, the silence of her room was broken by a loud static from her grandmother's digital clock. It was glowing green like it did when turned on. Jolie looked over to the radio, and it was indeed on. Her grandmother's voice filled the room from the radio. "I love you. Don't forget." I turned the light on and went over to the radio, and it turned off. I checked the plug, and it was as I suspected, not plugged in, Jolie recalled. On Christmas morning, she woke to find 3 presents under the tree from her grandmother. She had purchased them in September, and Jolie's mom found them in her cedar chest when she cleaned it out. Her grandmother had not been done communicating. I honestly believe with both occurrences that my grandmother was letting me know she was still around and checking on me, Jolie said. I always wish she would have been here to meet her great-grandchildren. To this day, I still receive signs that she is near, a faint smell of her perfume. Yes, I remember that she loves me. The second story tonight is a listener-submitted tale from Cynthia, which goes to show that the strangest things can happen during the most mundane routines. I was shopping at my local PetSmart on Friday, waiting in line, gazing out the front of the store, just waiting for the lady in front of me to finish with her transaction. They keep their numerous shopping carts shoved all together in 3 lines, parallel to the large glass front of the store. There's an automatic sliding door to the right of them, which was closed, and no one was using it or standing nearby. No one was in the front area of the store at all. The floor, of course, was completely flat and level like any modern store or supermarket. It was about 4 p.m. Suddenly, a shopping cart that was nested into the end of one of the lines of carts rolled backwards out of the lineup a few feet and then forcefully raced forward, slamming back into the parked carts with such force that it bounced back with a loud metallic clanging, finally stopping about 5 feet away from the rest of the carts. The lady in front of me saw the whole thing too and began to tell the cashier, the cart! The clerk, who was determined to keep her eyes on the cash register, said, "I know, it's the second time today." The lady in front of me tried to question her about it, but the clerk didn't have any answers and was obviously unnerved by the occurrence. The customer in front of me concluded by asking, "Is it someone who used to work here?" The clerk said, "We don't know." I was intrigued. Inquiring more about it when it was my turn, the clerk said it happens all the time, and apparently it has been for quite a while. She was obviously not happy about it. Thinking back, I recall feeling creeped out a few times in the back aisle of the store and the small hallway leading to their bathroom and the soda machine, but I had never seen anything happening there before. A former employee might hang around in those areas. Anyway, it seems interesting. I'd like to have a clip of their security camera, which must be focused on the area of the front door, but I doubt they would give it to me.
Wow. Well, now we have 2 stories to comment on. What do you think?
Well, with the first story, I love how there was a connection made with a lost family member. That's so amazingly sweet. I can't say that I've actually experienced that. I mean, is that bad, or did they just move on and be where they're supposed to be? I don't know. But the PetSmart story, I love this. I love anything that disrupts a boring trip to the store. Remember the one story we covered where the company was forced to send out an email in response to a ghost?
Right. The security guards.
We need more of that in everyday life.
Right. I agree. And you had me thinking about being contacted or not being contacted by a loved one after the crossover. That is kind of an interesting dilemma for us, the ones left mourning, isn't it? I think this is the way I think of it. If the recently deceased are still around, then it suggests that perhaps they're not ascending where they need to be, unless they come back after they ascend via some cosmic hall pass or something.
Right.
Although it's also said Buddhists believe that there is a period of 7 days where the spirit stays on this plane to sort of like help wrap things up and then ascends. So who knows? My thought is, if your loved one does not contact you after they die, and we're looking at you, Houdini, then really it's a good thing. That means they were able to easily let go of the world and all its material pitfalls and move on, right? And that's really the best thing we can hope for in the terms of our loved ones, even though
I agree.
It's hard on us.
You're right. I agree.
And, oh yeah, the PetSmart. You can literally haunt anywhere in the world and probably in an immeasurable number of dimensions. You can do better than a place that smells like dog food and wet ferrets. But then, looking back, there are definitely some former bosses that I would gladly go out of my way to torment in the afterlife. So what do I know?
Right.
Maybe he's or she is just...
You need the carts back. Here's the carts.
Living the dream. Living the dream. All right. Day 4.
Tonight's story is from the book Odd and Chilling Encounters by R.S. Russo. In 1998, I worked as a security guard at a local Christian college. The first night on the job, I was told it was my responsibility to patrol the campus all night and make sure the main doors were locked and to make sure all the lights were off in the chapel. It was to be locked by 11 p.m. Standard stuff. I started out walking around the campus, getting to know a few students and just checking everything out. When 11 p.m. came, I went to the chapel and down to the basement first. Getting to the bottom stairwell door, I realized it won't open. I push on it 4 or 5 times, but the door seems locked. So I go back up and out into the back door. The basement is locked down, all the lights are out, and it's secure. I go over to the stairwell door, and it opens easy for me from the outside. I figure it's just how the door is made. I go back upstairs into the stage where the light switches are. I look up, and I see what looks like a kid in the balcony. I yell for him, but he doesn't answer. Oddly enough, when I get up there, I can't find him. I get creeped out, but I figure it's late and I'm just seeing shadows. I go back down, cut all the lights, and lock up the chapel. At 3 a.m., I go out for the full campus rounds just to check up on everything. Heading across the quad, I notice that the lights are on in the basement of the chapel, as well as the front spotlight. I go to the basement door, and I find it still locked. I go in, I cut the lights, and as soon as I do, I hear a long, loud bang in the stairwell. I run in there, and I get up the stairs thinking I'm chasing someone, but there's no one anywhere. I go back down, and I leave the back door and lock it. As I walk around, I notice the spotlight is off. I check to see if it could be motion controlled, but it's not. Since it was my first night, I decided not to say anything. The second night changed that. I again had weird experiences around the chapel, but on night 2, I heard weird crying and sounds in the woods on the north side of campus. I also saw 2 strange hooded teens down on the southwest side, near where the tennis courts are. I tried to get close to them, but it seemed like they were constantly moving 20 or 30 yards away from me. The next shift I worked, I decided to ask the guy who hired me about the strange happenings. He said that one of the other guards would drop by and basically debrief me. The guard who showed up was around 300 pounds of pure muscle, a beast of a man. I told him everything and he said, "Yep, sounds about right." He then proceeded to tell me that everyone who's worked there overnight had some odd experience. He said that the stairway doors do not lock, but that he himself had spent 40 minutes one night locked between floors. He told me that he had to throw all his weight against both the doors, but they wouldn't move, and that each time he tried, he would hear this crazy laughter. He said he had chased what he thought were teens through the downstairs hall just to watch them disappear. Another guard had walked into the chapel and stumbled into what looked like a sacrifice with occult symbols drawn on the stage and had chased the people off wearing cloaks, only to find that all the evidence had disappeared when he came back after trying to catch the cloaked figures. All those occult symbols were constantly being found on campus. Needless to say, I didn't stay there long. All I'm going to say is, I worry about college cults. Really?
Churchy drama kids. Am I right? High five. It does make me wonder what the history is behind all of these sightings. Obviously it began with college kids dabbling in something they shouldn't have.
Probably.
But what happened? Maybe they did exactly what they wanted to do, and they just conjured a phantom loop of them doing and running from a ritual in this infinite creepy prank for the security guards. Or did something more sinister happen? I don't know. I think a Christian college would probably not want such a story to get out, so we're probably never going to know.
Exactly.
All right. Day 5.
Tonight's chilling tale comes to us from Reddit.com. My house was built in 1904. It's a single-family home, wood frame setting on a concrete block foundation. I've been living here for about 12 years. Of all the weird things that my siblings and me have seen or heard in this house, this one is my favorite. This happened to my brother. About 10 years ago, my brother and his best friends had started a garage band playing mostly Spanish rock, alternative music, but in Spanish. His friends could only get together on Sunday afternoons. They would practice until the early evening, and they would usually call it quits by 8 p.m. This was the time I usually showed up and went to bed, because I worked the graveyard shift. This happened in late fall, so the days were getting shorter, but they had just finished a long session when the decision to head to someone else's house came about. My brother handed his car keys to his buddy so they could load up the equipment. Everyone had to file out of the basement, and the tricky part was they needed to walk all the way to the back of the basement, up the back stairs, through the kitchen doorway, down the hall, into the living room, and out the front porch. Everyone was outside, sitting in my brother's truck, waiting for him. My brother was walking up the back stairs when he remembered that he left his pancakes in a to-go container sitting on a speaker in the basement. He made the decision to go back. Now, the basement is not clean with full sight lines. There had been partitions made, and the boiler and the main heating unit are right smack in the middle. So, after my brother walks back, he's about to retrieve his food container when out of the corner of his eye, he sees it. It's a shadowy figure right in his peripheral vision. This feeling of dread and uneasiness wash over my brother. We had been taught that if you were in the presence of a spirit or a ghost and you felt a bad vibe, to say a quick prayer or to cuss at it. My brother chose the latter. He basically just said, "Hey, screw you. I don't have time for this BS." My brother started to walk to the back of the basement and briskly up the stairs, closing doors and turning off lights as he was walking out. The last light switch is on the opposite side of the front door. Luckily, the door was open, and the light from the street lamp was flooding into the living room with its amber light. My brother said He felt something at his back, but at no point did he turn around. As he flicked the last switch, the living room went dark as the rest of the house. As he stepped out, he pulled on the door, closing it behind him. Still holding his food container in one hand, he jogged down the few porch steps. He walked towards the front gate. Our house resides far from the main street, essentially having a large front yard, but no rear garage. As he closed the gap between himself and his friend-laden truck, he kind of smiled and thought things over in his head, mad at himself for being spooked out when there was no reason. He climbed into the driver's side of the truck, put on his seatbelt, and getting ready to pull out of the parking spot directly in front of the house when one of his friends asked, "Hey, wait, what about your brother? Isn't he coming with us?" My brother answered, "What do you mean? He went to work early tonight and he's already gone. Do you see his car anywhere?" The next question they asked was, "So then, who was walking behind you when you were leaving the house?" I know. And the next question I ask is, how do you go back to the house after this? Just brush your teeth, put on your PJs, get in bed, and shut off the lights.
You don't. Or you nerve up, take a deep breath, and just accept your first groupie, no matter who they are. This is a great story. I love this one. All right. Day 6.
This evening's story comes to us from the book Phantom Messages by William J. Hall and Jimmy Pentonito. Here we go. Linda lived in a house that had no apparent paranormal activity until the following occurrence happened at the age of 15. Linda and her friend Jennifer got together at Linda's house to hang out after school. They started tossing out ideas of what they could do together. After different suggestions, they decided on making their own radio show. The two pretend stars decided to sing parody songs and to be DJs. The process was to play albums and then record it all on a cassette tape recorder as one cohesive show. The cassette tape recorder used was the small desktop style. Linda inserted a new cassette tape so their project could sound its best. The two friends sat on the floor by the foot of Linda's bed, only a few feet from the record player. It was a simple one without a radio built in, but it did have 2 large speakers. The record player remained unplugged since they were going to record the music later for the show. Linda told us, "We were doing a little introduction to our pretend radio show when our attention was interrupted by an unusual sound. Through the unplugged record player speakers came a muffled song, almost like the sound a baby's mobile would make. It was the song Home on the Range. I would also describe the sound like it was one of those wind-up music boxes playing it, which made it even creepier. There were no lyrics. It was just instrumental. The music played for only 10 to 15 seconds. The 2 startled teens looked at each other. Jennifer said, "Lynn? Lynn?" The 2 immediately ran down the stairs to her father, who was the only person home at the time. Since they were recording the show, they had recorded it on cassette tape. They regained their composure and decided to brave a trip back upstairs to the bedroom. The tape was played back to see if the song was recorded. It was there. Then the recording turned stranger. A few seconds after you hear feet running down the stairs, a voice followed the eerie music. Linda explains, "It sounded like a tortured voice saying, 'Let me out.' Just those 3 words, but very stretched out. It was either a woman's voice or a child's voice, and it sounded very far away. Still, the voice was clear enough for the words to be obvious. Trying to be little detectives, they checked the plug to the record player and speakers just to make sure they were unplugged. They were. The two could only look at each other in disbelief. Years later, Linda had another unusual experience. After Linda was married, the couple moved into the second floor of a 3-family house that belonged to the family. Her grandmother lived on the first floor, and her Aunt Clara lived on the 3rd floor. Periodically, the couple would argue, and Aunt Clara was always disturbed when they did. They could hear her yelling at them from upstairs. For a wedding present, Aunt Clara bought the couple a music box with 2 swans on top. She presented it by telling Linda that swans mate for life. They only have one partner. If their partner dies, they have been known to die from a broken heart. Aunt Clara passed away in July of 1999. About a month later, the couple was arguing over something small. During the heat of their exchange, items began to fall off the shelves. These items were nowhere near the edge, and it seemed unlikely for them to just fall over. The two looked at each other in wonder. They immediately thought that Aunt Clara was not happy. On second thought, it also could just be their imaginations. The next time they had an argument, items fell off the shelves again. Now, they knew. It had to be Aunt Clara telling them to quit it. The final convincer was after all the items fell, music was heard. The Swan music box started playing.
Well, here's another 2-parter for us. What do you think?
Well, with the first part of the story with the DJ show, I think we should just record everything at all times so we can capture more creepy ghost evidence, because that was awesome.
Yeah, that would be thoroughly expensive.
I guess you're right. And I love that Aunt Clara stuck to her guns even after she died, but boy, how loudly did they fight?
No.
Passionate.
If you're in a relationship that's so bad that dead relatives are drawing attention to how many times you fight, yeah, I think it's time to kick, he's the only boy I know who likes Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, to the curb. You can do better. Even the dead can see that. As for the earlier story, I think everyone of a certain generation made a radio show with the family tape recorder. I did. Did you?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, and it's really cool to hear a ghost story come from one of those rites of passages.
Right. It was bound to happen.
Yeah. Oh, and the fact that the voice was heard on the replaying of the tape after the sound of the retreating footsteps was deliciously creepy.
Yes, I agree.
That was like a cinematic moment.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Love it. All right. Day 7.
Tonight's story is from the book Odd and Chilling Encounters by R.S. Russo. The school where I attend college was once a Japanese military base, and the building that stands as the admin building today was built during the Japanese occupation. Proof of this are the prison cells in the basement of the building with just small barred windows for air to pass through. Today, the basement is off limits to everyone, but during my years of freshman, this was a working room for some art students. I can still remember it clearly. One day after my classes, one of the art professors invited me to watch some of the students paint in the basement. He was like a mentor and a father to me. Even if I was in the business department, he knows my knack for the arts. So he has always invited me over to watch his students work on their masterpieces. It was past 6 p.m. and the sky was getting dark. All my friends went home early, so I figured I could stop by for a few minutes before I had to head home. When I stepped into the basement, I was immediately greeted with a kind of depressed feeling. During this time, I didn't really believe any of the spooky stories the upperclassmen told us freshmen, brushing them off as merely a way to scare us off of their territory. What I felt, however, was something I couldn't explain. It was heavy, very heavy, and even with the bright lights, the room still seemed dark. I sat down in one area while the professor introduced me to some of his students. I noticed some empty bottles of beer on the tables where the paints and the brushes were, and was told that the students would sometimes drink while working, as it helps them with their art. Awkwardly, I just sat there while observing everyone around me. There were canvases on easels all over the place, paint cans, brushes, wooden blocks for carving tools, and old newspapers. About an hour went by, and I was hungry. There were only 4 of us in the basement left, including myself and the professor. I stood up and was about to head to the door when the lights suddenly went out. Through the small windows, I saw there were lights outside, so apparently only the basement lost power. The professor then told us to stay put while he takes out his flashlight. Just as he finishes those words, I hear glass breaking, and then another. Someone screamed. Our professor turned on his flashlight and asked us to slowly approach him so we could all get out together and not bump into anything. We did so and made it out, just as another glass on the far corner of the room shattered. By this time, I was really shaking. The room suddenly felt even heavier, and the smell of something other than paint just wafted in. It smelled like smoke or burnt plastic. I don't really know, but it smelled burnt. We made it out, all 4 of us. Just as we started asking our professor questions, the lights went back on in the basement. Our professor said he had to go back down so he could turn off the lights and lock up. Without thinking twice, I volunteered to go with him and to pick up the other 2 students' bags they had left as we hurried out. As we descended the stairs, the smell of something burnt got stronger. The professor noticed it too. He covered his nose with his handkerchief. When we reached the basement, we immediately saw that something was wrong. All of the canvases were strewn all over the floor, face down. This couldn't have been possible, as the 4 of us were just in one corner of the room, and the canvases were all propped up on easels before the lights went out. What was even more unnerving were the beer bottles. They didn't fall like I thought they did when we heard glass shattering. Rather, they were all exactly where they were on the tables, with only their top halves broken and shattered. It was as if they were broke right where they stood. The smell of burnt something got even stronger, which our professor described as the smell of gunpowder. It suddenly grew very hot and suffocating in the room. He looked at me with fear. We grabbed the bags, turned off the lights, and hurried outside. The moment we stepped outside, I broke down. I felt like something was pressing on me, and it was just forcing me to cry. I didn't feel fear, but rather loss, and it was making me cry so much the 2 art students had to help me sip some water as I was shaking. That was the last time the basement was used as a room for students. Over the next few days, materials were taken out, leaving some old chairs and tables and supplies behind. The doors were then heavily bolted, and a huge "Unauthorized Persons Keep Out" sign was stuck on them. Our professor later told me that the basement was where Filipino and American soldiers alike were imprisoned and executed by the Japanese troops during the war. The administration thought keeping it well lit and occupied with people would make it all right to be used. However, now I know that there are just some places best left alone.
Holy guacamole. Wow.
So I love this story
Yeah.
because we haven't really touched on stone tape theory yet on Odd Tonic, but
Right.
the idea that a space can absorb the experiences that took place there is really evident in this story. It's terribly sad, but it's fascinating still.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. A couple of things that stood out to me was this sounded like the narrator's first visit to the art space. And it seemed like he was a bit sensitive. Right from the very moment he entered the basement, he started picking up on the bad juju going on down there, the oppressive feeling. And it makes me wonder if his presence inadvertently tipped the scales or fired the place up with energy.
Yeah, could very well be.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
Scary.
Yes.
All right. Day 8.
Tonight's story is from the book Odd and Chilling Encounters by R.S. Russo. Let's begin. I worked for a short time as the night watchman at a very old historic cemetery. I worked the 4 p.m. to 12 a.m. shift. The cemetery generally closed at 6 p.m., so around 5 p.m., I would lock the main gate. Then I would start driving through the cemetery to notify any visitors that we'd be closing soon. I'd instruct them to park in a line in front of the locked main gate, and when my drive through the grounds was complete, I would unlock the main gate. Everyone would leave, and I would lock the gate behind them. One day, I'm in the middle of my final drive, and I see an old lady walking slowly on the sidewalk alongside a mausoleum. The mausoleum was hundreds of feet long, about 20 feet tall, and had no breaks in it. It was one long stretch. The road ran directly alongside the sidewalk of the mausoleum, so I pulled up behind the lady to tell her we were closing. I get out of my car, take my eyes off her for a split second as I'm getting out of my car, and when I shut the door and look up, she's gone. Completely vanished. I didn't think anything paranormal at first. I just thought maybe I lost sight of her. But the sidewalk and the road were completely empty. I ran all the way around to check the back of the mausoleum, but no one was there. Across from the mausoleum was a whole field of graves, and I looked out over every row. No soul in sight. I finish up my roundup, and I sit in my car for the rest of the night in a well-lit area. I saw a fully visible person. I know it. No tricks of light, no hallucination, plain as day. This encounter seemed to break open the proverbial dam because after this, I had numerous unexplainable occurrences. Normally, my then girlfriend, now my wife, would drop by around 8 p.m. and bring me dinner, since I couldn't really leave. I never told her about my experiences because I didn't want to freak her out. As I'm walking her back to her car to leave, I see her reach back and touch her ponytail, then look around with a weird expression on her face. I ask her what's wrong, and she says, "Nothing. I must have gotten my ponytail caught on a tree branch or something." So I point out to her that the closest tree was 20 feet away, and that's impossible. Then she gets real pale and says it felt like someone ran their hand through her hair, front to back, and then pulled on her ponytail. We were both pretty freaked out, and she left. She never came back and brought me dinner again. I was originally hired because the cemetery had a period of time where they experienced some grave robbers and people breaking in to perform satanic rituals. I was 21 at the time, doing this as a side job, with no gun, no weapons, or anything like that. I was given a barcode scanner and was told to drive through the entire cemetery every hour or so to patrol and to scan each of the pre-posted barcodes to prove I was actually doing it. The cemetery was massive, pretty much broken into 3 parts: the newer part, the historic part, and the famous part where celebrities and other famous people were buried. I did this routine once and never did it again, going so far as to break the barcode scanner so I wouldn't have to do it. While I was driving, it was pitch black. Coming around a long curved road, my headlights picked up on what I could have sworn were a pair of legs walking across the path, but only up to the knee. Shoes, pants, knees, then absolutely nothing. I stopped dead in the road and just watched this pair of legs with no body cross the road 10 feet in front of me. I put the car in reverse, did what felt like the longest turn of my life, and rushed straight back to the parking lot. Other things were lesser experiences, just hearing strange noises and seeing floating lights in the cemetery after I know for sure everyone was gone. Sometimes I'd hear weird animal sounds that I couldn't recognize too. The guy who worked the day shift there, which was 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., was a grimy dude. I'll call him Bart. Part of our jobs was to go around the cemetery and check the graves for personal effects left by family members and remove them. Many people left things like toys for children who had passed away, birthday cards, mementos, etc. I personally hated this policy and refused to enforce it. Who was I to take a dead child's toy fire engine and throw it away? But Bart had a habit of scouring the cemetery for things he deemed valuable and taking them home, instead of throwing them away or bringing them to the office to be picked up by the family. In the short time I worked there, Bart's mental state deteriorated. He started spending hours there, even after his shift was over, walking around the cemetery and drinking heavily. He seemed detached and even more out there than when I first met him. Eventually, when I didn't see him for a week or so, I asked about him, and my boss said he had just never called in or showed up and was never heard from again. I often wondered if he developed some type of attachment from bringing so many objects home he shouldn't have. Once Bart stopped showing up, I picked up his Saturday morning shift. It was a quiet day, so I pulled my car around the back of the old chapel to take a nap. The chapel was surrounded by 12-foot-high hedges, so I figured it was a good spot to park for an hour and shut my eyes. I fell asleep and wake up to see my car surrounded by dead people. So real, so vivid, so much detail. They were all pressed up against the glass and windshield. They had on the outfits they were buried in, suits, dresses, all dirty and in different stages of decomposition. No one spoke. No one moved. They all just stared like I was some zoo exhibit. Then, I woke up. I had been asleep and it was a dream. The thing is, it felt so real. I have never had a dream so real, so vivid before or after. I took it as a message. I called my boss and quit as soon as I left at 4 p.m. I go back to that cemetery from time to time because I have 3 grandparents and an aunt buried there. I never linger too long, though, and always make sure I'm out long before it gets dark. So I've always thought that cemeteries are very quiet and serene, but you could not pay me to work in one. You can't tell me from day to day, always being there, that nothing is going to happen. It's like, no, thank you. They don't give bonuses for that.
I agree. I used to think that graveyard stories were a lazy trope. In my mind, people are dead long before they're taken to the graveyard, well, with any luck. So why would they haunt it?
Right.
You know, it's not like they've had any attachment to the place before they died. And I'll bet that many people never even visit the cemetery that they are eventually buried in while they're living. So it seemed to me that since people are frightened by death, a graveyard would be a natural place to set a true ghost story. But of course, stories like these over the years have definitely changed my mind.
Right. I think that there is that certain aspect of not realizing you're dead and kind of following your body around and then even not seeing what's happening, and then you just kind of stay there.
Yeah. And one of the truly interesting things about some of the stories that we have read in regard to cemeteries, particularly those with mausoleums. Mausoleums seem to be a lightning rod for paranormal activity, is it seems like it's due to the social quality of the mausoleum.
Could be.
You're surrounded by tens, hundreds.
Depends on how big, right?
Right.
Some family members too.
Yeah.
So there's that family history.
Do you remember this story from Halloween?
Oh, yes. How can I forget?
Dear guest, if you have not heard the mausoleum story from our
Deluxe Halloween edition,
seek that one out. That's a scary one. Okay. Day 9.
Tonight's ghost story comes to us from Brad Steiger's book, Real Ghosts, Restless Spirits, and Haunted Places. One day, I was working with a friend in a brand new home in Ogden, Utah. We were doing the heating and air conditioning. My friend was checking the furnace and discovered it had a bad transformer, so he left to go get a new one. While he was gone, I continued installing the ductwork. I got an eerie feeling and looked over my shoulder and saw an old woman at the base of the stairs. I figured she was the homeowner. I said hi and asked her if she needed anything. She just shook her head no and smiled. I went about my business. Then I felt the same eerie feeling. I looked over my shoulder and there she was, about 5 feet from me. I got off my ladder and I said, "Can I help you?" She smiled and once again shook her head. Just then, I heard my partner pulling into the driveway. I turned to see where the woman was, and she was already by the base of the stairs, about 50 feet away. I said, "Are you sure you don't need anything?" She just looked at me and motioned with her finger for me to come with her. Of course I said, "No way." Then I heard my friend enter the home on the first floor. The old woman again motioned for me to follow her. She was backing towards the crawl space just under the stairs. I took my eyes off her for a second to try and figure out where my friend was, and when I looked back, I saw the most horrifying old woman motioning to me with a bony, leathery finger. This time, she spoke. "Get over here." I watched her disappear into the crawl space. That was it. I got out of there fast. Finally, my friend joined me and I told him the story. He just laughed and told me to stay outside if it would make me feel better. That's exactly what I did. I did some research on that area and learned that most of the land had been used as a Native American tribal burial ground. To this day, I haven't returned to that site. Our second story tonight comes from G. Michael Vasey's book, The Scariest Best of MyHauntedLife2.com, True Stories of the Paranormal. About 4 years ago, I worked at a nursing home. I worked night shift with 3 or 4 other people. Each night, we were assigned to a hall on which we did our rounds every 2 hours and answered call lights as needed. In our downtime between rounds, we would usually sit in the dining hall, which was located right in the middle. For the first couple of months I worked there, nothing happened. I was a bit disappointed and said so one night between rounds. I had been told detailed stories of things that had happened and was beginning to think that people were doing just that, telling stories. When it was time to do rounds again that night, I moved from room to room without any trouble until I got to the very last room. I checked in on the patient and was moving towards the door when the bathroom door slammed shut quite loudly. I almost jumped right out of my shoes, and without reopening the door, I ran out of the room. I went back in about a half hour later and found the bathroom door wide open again. Call lights would turn on in rooms with no patients staying in them. We'd go in to check and find the room empty. They even called in an electrician to make sure there were no faulty wires, as we had to log every call light. We would hear someone walking down the hall, only to find no one out of bed. I recalled one night I was in the laundry room by myself, switching clothes to the dryer, when I distinctly heard someone calling my name. I thought it was odd because it was a male voice, and there were no males working that night. We would hear what sounded like large cans falling in the kitchen, yet when the cooks arrived in the morning, they would investigate only to find everything in order. I suppose the eeriest things that happened were in one ward, where all the patients who were on their deathbeds were moved, so they could receive care around the clock. There were cold spots in many rooms. Equipment would malfunction even after being thoroughly checked out, and voices could be heard. I remember one particular night where I was assigned to be at the bedside of a man who eventually passed away early the next morning. I had stepped out of the room for a moment to retrieve something, and when I returned, I was shocked to find a woman standing at the foot of the bed. There was no possible way she could have entered the room without me seeing her. When I questioned her as to why she was there, she just smiled sadly at me and then disappeared right before my eyes. I also started to notice there would be a constant whispering, though you could never understand just what was being said. That place was alive with spirits, and I won't return again. I now work elsewhere. Of course he works elsewhere.
Yeah, going back to what you said before, there are some professions that deserve higher pay across the board. Teachers, EMTs, graveyard workers, and nursing home staff.
Yeah.
They deal with stuff that most 9-to-5ers can't imagine. As for the guy installing the ductwork in the basement, oh my God, that was a creepy sighting.
Right.
The rapid movement in the blink of an eye and the horrible transformation. And what do you think would have happened if he had followed her into the crawl space?
Yeah, I really don't know. Would his friend have found him dead under mysterious circumstances?
Yeah, maybe.
And I also wonder about the unfortunate, unlucky family that happened to buy that house.
Oh, God, yeah.
But it sounds like the whole neighborhood may have had a problem.
Oh, right, because it was said...
The whole grounds, right?
Right.
And do you get to know your neighbors quickly in that situation? Is the neighborhood ghost problem a good icebreaker?
Right. 3 a.m., everyone's standing out in
in the cul-de-sac. So why are you here?
Oh, just checking the begonias. Certainly not due to my walls bleeding. Day 10.
Tonight's story comes to us from Brad Steiger's book, Real Ghosts, Restless Spirits, and Haunted Places. This is a personal account from a man named Patrick. In 1990, shortly after Deb, her 3-year-old daughter, and I moved into our apartment, strange things began to happen. There seemed to be something else in the place with us. All these years later, I'm still asking myself what it was. Within the first week of moving in, I was awakened around 5 o'clock in the morning by what sounded, for all the world, like a small child barking like a dog. I sat up in bed. Debbie woke a few seconds later and listened to the sounds with me. It came from the hallway, so we assumed that her daughter had gotten up in the wee hours and was pretending to be a puppy. Not all that unusual for a 3-year-old. I got up to put her back to bed, but as I opened the bedroom door, the sound moved down the hallway and into the living room. I followed, and it kept moving and barking at a distance of what I'd estimate to be about 6 feet in front of me. As I got into the living room, the barking moved on to the next room, the kitchen. I stood in the living room and tried to figure out what was happening. The lights from outside the building were spilling into the room, and it slowly occurred to me that if the baby had been playing, I surely would have seen her cross the room between the hall and the kitchen. I listened to the puppy bark in the next room, and a chill went down my spine. I now had no idea what I was dealing with. The barking faded within the next moment, and I backed down the hall, ducking into the little girl's room, and of course, found her sound asleep. I roused her and I asked her if she had been pretending to be a puppy. "No," came the expected groggy response. I carried her back to our room and put her in bed between us. I stayed awake until it was time to get up for work, making certain that puppy didn't return, but debating what I would do if it did. We never heard it again. A few months later, I was up in the middle of the night using the bathroom. I was in total darkness. No windows in the room, no light, just darkness. Suddenly, from the area to my left, which would have been the bathtub, I heard something sharp and loud enough to make me jump. It was a voice very clearly shouting, "Bellyache!" The voice was that of a child, but there was something rough, almost gruff about it, as if the child in question was trying to do a voice. Of course, I flipped on the light. Nothing. Not that I was totally surprised. Less dramatic incidents became frequent enough so that Deb and I began to half joke about the apartment being haunted. Deb said that she had often seen the figure of a child moving up and down the hall past our bedroom door during the night. I remember her describing a little boy enveloped in a soft blue glow. She also admitted this could have been a series of waking dreams. The last thing that I'll relate happened shortly before we moved out. Again, it was late at night. Our kitchen faucet leaked and dripped fairly noisily on occasion. I was lying in bed, listening to the drip. It had developed a steady rhythm, as drips will. Suddenly, the rhythm changed. The drip sound itself changed in pitch, and the thing actually played a tune. Now, I could write this off as a dream, but at that point, after a few bars, Debbie had groaned in disbelief next to me and asked, "Was that Funeral March of the Marionettes?" Yeah, I answered, nodding in the dark. That's what I heard. We both sighed deeply and held each other close the rest of the night. While none of these incidents may fall under the classification of terrifying, they were certainly disturbing. I was glad when we moved when we did. Whatever was in that apartment seemed to have a consciousness. It seemed aware of us.
Yeah, nice, right?
Right, perfect. You're wasting your talent. That just makes me feel like Pop Goes the Weasel would have been so much more terrifying. I'd be down the street. I'd be so out of there.
That's so true. I had never thought of that. Nicely done. Well, in all seriousness, and this seems like a quick transition, but what I have to say is absolutely true. Stories of child ghosts are the most poignant to me.
Definitely.
I really feel for them. Unless they turn out to not be child ghosts at all, you know, those ones that turn out to be completely terrifying. We'll address those at a different time.
It's like, no.
It's like, you believe I'm a child? Okay, watch this.
Right.
But anyway, the stories where you can just tell it's a young lost soul.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, just gets me right there.
What I love about this, again, is that it's just this slice of life story. And with details you just wouldn't dream up on your own without it really happening.
Right,
I mean, why would you?
Right. I'm going to come up with this scary ghost story about a kid ghost barking like a dog.
Right. Write that down.
This is going to make me millions.
And also, again, can you imagine dying only to go on to haunt a random apartment?
Yeah.
If you hold on to anything, dear guest, remember, after you die, just move on.
Let it all go and move on. Day 11.
Tonight's story comes from the book Haunted Healthcare by Richard Estep. Over the long course of her medical career as a paramedic, Trish thought she had seen it all. Responding to shootings, stabbings, and all manner of death, illness, and injury sometimes gives one a somewhat jaded view of life. We tend to think we have seen it all. But then, every so often, something happens which reminds us just how untrue that can be. One such experience happened to Trish back in 1991. The hospital had a reputation for being haunted. A lot of the employees, especially those who worked the daytime, just shrugged it off, dismissing the ghost stories and going about their everyday business. The night shift workers, on the other hand, were a different matter entirely. It seemed that practically every nurse who worked late there avoided the 7th floor like the plague. Patients were no longer placed on that floor as there were issues with the electrical wiring, and it was said to be extremely haunted. Being quite the salty EMT with a side interest in all things paranormal, Trish naturally wanted to go up there and check it out for herself. Unfortunately, that was a no-go. As a safety measure, the elevator had been programmed to not stop at the 7th floor, and she didn't particularly feel like climbing up 7 flights of steps at the end of a long shift. One night, Trish and her partner were finishing up an interfacility transfer, which usually involves taking a patient from one hospital or nursing home to another. They had dropped the patient off on one of the upper floors, turning patient care over to the on-duty nurse and wheeling their stretcher to the elevator for the return trip. Trish hit the button for the ground floor. The elevator began to descend. She was lost in her own thoughts, hoping that the rest of her shift would be a quiet one, when the elevator car suddenly stopped on the 7th floor. "Oh," she whispered. Suddenly, her desire to delve into the mysteries of the haunted floor wasn't as strong as it had been just a few minutes before. The elevator doors opened onto a long hallway that was completely black. 2 rows of open doors stretched away into the distance, disappearing into the gloom. The 2 EMTs stood there in silence for a moment, just staring into the darkness. Trish's partner broke the silence with a hushed whisper. "What do you want to do?" Wordlessly, Trish stepped off the elevator, wheeling the stretcher along with her. Putting on the brake to prevent it from rolling off, the 2 EMTs set out to explore the haunted floor, breaking out their flashlights to help them navigate. Their first stop was the nurse's station, long since abandoned save for a few scattered sheets of paper. "Hello," Trish called out. "Is there anybody there?" There was no answer. The EMTs decided to explore, prowling the hallways. Each patient room they passed had a fully made-up bed, the crisp white sheets coated in a layer of dust. The atmosphere felt heavy and oppressive. Trish was unable to shake the distinct feeling she was being followed, though whenever she turned to look over her shoulder, there was never a soul to be seen. A sudden voice, loud and scratchy, made the 2 EMTs jump halfway out of their skin. Fortunately, there was a very simple explanation. Dispatch was calling them over the radio, checking in on their whereabouts and making sure they were okay. Telling the dispatcher that everything was just fine and they would be clearing the hospital and returning to service shortly, she let out a long, slow breath. The unexpected radio call had startled her. Tempting fate, her partner called out, "There's no such thing as ghosts!" Big mistake. As if in direct answer to her ill-chosen words, a blast of icy cold air suddenly gusted past them, making them both shriek in fear. Each and every one of the doors on either side of the hallway slammed shut, the dull thud almost deafening. Trish and her partner screamed again, all thoughts of further exploration now gone. They turned and bolted for the elevator, making to drag the stretcher inside without bothering to kick the brake off first. Except the doors wouldn't open. Just as they had been warned, the 7th floor elevator call button had been disabled. They were stuck up there. Trish tried to call out on her radio, but all she could get was static. Desperately, she tried to think of a solution. Cell phones weren't around back then, and with the walkie-talkie not working, that only left a landline. Suddenly, she remembered seeing a phone back at the nurse's station. To get to it, all she had to do was run the gauntlet of doors. Trish decided right then and there that if the doors all spontaneously opened themselves, there was a real chance she might need to change her underwear before the night was over. Fortunately for Trish and her partner, the journey to the nurse's station was uneventful, even if it did seem to take an age to get there. Finally, picking up the phone, she dialed security and explained her plight. Moments later, the elevator pinged and the doors opened. A security guard emerged, looking less than thrilled to be called away from whatever he was doing in order to fetch two wayward EMTs who had gotten themselves trapped. The guard beckoned them into the elevator. Trish and her partner managed to somehow squeeze themselves and the stretcher in there. Taking note of their pale faces and general frazzled appearance, he simply shook his head and chuckled. Somebody should have warned you both. The ghosts up here on 7th just love messing around with the newbies.
Wow.
Yeah.
Phew. That's a good one.
Uh-huh. And another location just saturated with energy and spirits, which is completely understandable. I mean, I really do feel like we live in a culture that just shuns death and the afterlife. Yeah. We aren't prepared as a society, and I worry that the places where people die are just cluttered with souls that don't know what to do.
Yeah.
To the point where we just need to close hospital wings down because we'd rather not deal with it. I mean, what does that mean about us?
As you know, I completely agree. We need to get over ourselves, embrace the fact that death waits for us all, and have a service in place that will help us transition when our time comes. And not just the physical transition into death, but preparation for the mental and emotional shock when you realize that your spirit doesn't die along with your body. If you're not prepared, then you're right. You potentially have an entire floor of stuck and confused souls. Yeah. And that's perhaps one of the saddest things I think we've ever said. Moving on. Day 12. For our big finish, we have selected a rather infamous and particularly chilling tale, that of a poltergeist who terrorized John Bell and his family over 200 years ago, a vicious entity known as the Bell Witch. This telling is from Brad Steiger, excerpted from his wonderful book, Real Ghosts, Restless Spirits, and Haunted Places. Settle in, dear guest. It's going to get spooky.
The story begins in 1817. One night, the John Bell family was disturbed by mysterious rappings on the window of their cabin near Clarksville, Tennessee. Later that evening, 12-year-old Elizabeth Betsy Bell began to complain that there was an invisible rat gnawing on her bedpost. At midnight, the entire family, John and Lucy and their children Betsy, John, Drury, Joel, and Richard, were disturbed by having their covers jerked off their beds in a rough manner. And everyone in the Bell family heard a strange sucking noise, an eerie smacking of lips, as if an invisible baby was nursing. When the Bell family arose the next morning, stones littered the floor of the front room, and furniture had been overturned. The children were wide-eyed and spoke of ghosts and goblins. John Bell lectured his family severely. They would keep the problem to themselves. They didn't want their family to become the subject of common gossip. That night, Richard was awakened by something pulling his hair so hard, his head lifted right off the pillow. Joel began screaming at his brother's invisible attacker, and from her room, Betsy began howling that the gnawing rat was pulling her hair too. Most of the family awakened the next day with sore scalps from having their hair yanked and tugged during the night. And John Bell reversed his decision. They needed help. That day, he would confide in James Johnson, their neighbor and closest friend. Johnson accompanied his friend to the Bell cabin that evening. The tale that Bell told was a strange one, but Johnson knew that John Bell was neither a drinker nor a liar. While he watched at Betsy's bedside that night, Johnson saw the young girl receive several blows on the cheeks from an invisible attacker. John admonished the phantom assailant in the name of God. There was no activity from the ghost for several minutes, and then something yanked little Betsy's hair with such force that she screamed in pain. Again, Johnson admonished the evil spirit, and it released its grip. After witnessing this, Johnson made two conclusions. The invisible spirit understood the English language, and, for some reason, 12-year-old Betsy was the center of the haunting. The next day, Johnson met with other neighbors, and they agreed to help the family as best they could. A committee was selected to keep watch at the Bell house all night to try to keep the evil spirit from molesting Betsy. But this well-intended effort provoked an especially vicious onslaught on the unfortunate girl. A number of neighbors volunteered to have their daughters sleep with Betsy, but they were terrorized as well. Betsy was taken out of the cabin and into the home of neighbors, but the nasty, hair-pulling entity simply followed her there and upset the other households. Each night, the house was filled with those who sat up trying to get the ghost to communicate with them. There seemed little doubt that somehow the ghost was able to feed itself upon the energy of the psyches of the true believers who gathered nearly every evening in the Bell home. Soon, the spirit entity was powerful enough to venture outside the cabin and away from Betsy, its previous center of energy. Neighbors reported seeing lights, like candles or lamps, moving through the fields, and farmers became the victims of stone-throwing attacks from the Bell Witch. But the pelting seemed to be more in the nature of mischief than some of the other manifestations of the Bell Witch. Young boys in the area often played catch with the witch if she happened to throw something at them on their way home from school. Once, an observer witnessed several boys who were suddenly pelted with sticks that flew from a nearby thicket. He noted that the sticks did not strike the boys with much force, and, with a great deal of merriment, the boys gathered up the sticks and tossed them back into the thicket. Once again, the sticks came flying out. This time, the observer cut notches in several of the sticks before the boys returned to fire. He testified he was able to identify his markings when the Bell Witch once again threw the sticks from the thicket. But the witch was not at all playful with any scoffers who came to the Bell home to expose the phenomena as trickery. Those who stayed the night had covers jerked from their beds, and some were slapped soundly on the face. These blows were heard distinctly by the Bell family. Like the open palm of a heavy hand striking flesh, one of them wrote in a diary. Spiritualists, clergymen, reporters, and curiosity seekers traveled to the Bell farm and tried to get the witch to declare herself and her intentions. And one day, the ghost began to speak. At first, the witch's voice was an indistinct babble, and then it became a louder, kind of husky whisper issuing forth from shadowy corners of the cabin. After a few more attempts, the ghost spoke in a full-toned voice that spoke to people not only in the darkness, but in lighted rooms and in daytime hours. When Betsy was accused of trickery or ventriloquism, John Jr. brought in a doctor to examine her. He placed a hand over Betsy's mouth and listened at her throat while the voice of the ghost chatted noisily from a far corner of the room. The doctor stated firmly that young Betsy was definitely not making the sounds. Betsy began to suffer from seizures and fainting spells, similar to those which spirit mediums undergo when in a trance. Observers noted that the spells came on at regular hours, just before the witch put in an appearance. The ghost was always silent when the girl lay prone upon her bed. Then after Betsy recovered, the witch would begin her haunting once again. From the very beginning, the witch had been outspoken in its hatred of John Bell, Betsy's father. "I'll keep after him until the end of his days," the ghost often swore to visitors in the Bell home. "Old Jack Bell's days are numbered." John Bell complained of a strange pain in his throat. He had described it as a feeling like a stick stuck crosswise, punching each side of his jaws. As the visits of the ghost became more aggressive, Bell was often plagued by swelling of the tongue that lasted for 10 to 15 hours, leaving him unable to talk or eat. Once, a visitor asked the entity its identity, and the witch replied, "I am a spirit who was once very happy, but who has been disturbed and made unhappy. I will remain in this house and worry old Jack Bell until I kill him." Later, the witch declared itself to be the spirit of a Native American, and it sent the family on a wild bone chase to gather up all its skeletal remains. "If my bones are all put back together, I'll be able to rest in peace," the entity once said deceitfully. When the Bell family admitted that they had been unable to find any of the bones of the old warrior, the witch cackled and informed them that she was really the ghost of old Kate Batts. Interestingly, Kate Batts was not dead at the time of the haunting. It was not actually a witch. She was a rather eccentric woman who was quite shrewd in her dealings with the citizens of Clarksville, and may have been given the title of witch from certain irate townspeople. John Bell had run afoul with Kate in the matter of some territorial disagreements, and there was likely bad blood between them. The Bell home became even more crowded when members of the witch's ghost family moved in with her. 4 nasty entities named Black Dog, Mathematics, Syphocryphy, and Jerusalem, each speaking in a distinct voice of its own, soon made every night a maddening raucous party. The sounds of riotous laughter rattled the shingles of the Bell home, and witnesses noted the strong scent of whiskey that permeated every room in the house. The Bell Witch was adept at producing odd objects out of thin air. At one of Mrs. Bell's Bible study groups, the ladies were showered with fresh fruit. Betsy's friends were treated to bananas at one of her birthday parties. "Those came from the West Indies," the witch told the delighted girls. "I picked them myself." Although John Bell was the butt of malicious pranks and cruel blows, his wife, Lucy Bell, was looked after attentively by the witch. Once, when Mrs. Bell was ill, the witch was heard telling Lucy to hold out her hands. When she did, a large quantity of hazelnuts dropped into her palms. "Eat them, poor Luce," the witch instructed her. "They will do you good." When Lucy Bell weakly protested that she did not have the strength to crack the nuts, the witch volunteered to perform the act on her behalf. Family members and neighbors watched in wide-eyed awe as the nuts cracked open and the meats were sorted from the shells. The witch was also adept at producing pins and needles. Lucy Bell was provided with enough pins to supply the entire county, but sometimes the witch would impishly hide them in bedclothes or in chair cushions, where they would jab an unsuspecting victim. John Jr., Betsy's favorite brother, was the only other member of the family who received decent treatment from the witch. He could even talk back to the witch and get away with his sass. On the other hand, Joel and Richard were often whipped unmercifully by the ghost, and Drury was so frightened of the witch that he never married, fearing that the entity might someday return and single out his wife and children. Betsy and her father by far received the brunt of the witch's ill nature. The cruelest act perpetrated on Betsy was causing the dissolution of her engagement to Joshua Gardner. The entity protested violently when the engagement was announced and begged John Jr. to help sever the relationship. According to the witch, Betsy would never know a day of happiness if she married Joshua. The witch screamed at Joshua whenever he entered the Bell home and embarrassed both young people by shouting obscenities about them in front of their friends. Richard Bell noted in his diary that the vile devil never ceased to torment Betsy, insulting her modesty, sticking pins in her body, pinching and bruising her flesh, slapping her, disheveling and tangling her hair. An old friend of John Bell, General Andrew Jackson, heard that a malignant spirit was interfering in the course of true love between Betsy and Joshua. At the urging of his wife, Jackson set out to the Bell farm in the company of several servants and a professional witch layer. Along the way, the party picked up a number of other rugged individuals who swore they could handle the Bell witch. As the Jackson party neared the Bell farm, Jackson's driver was startled when the wheels of the general's coach suddenly froze and would not budge. Jackson ordered the men to put their backs to the coach, but when the combined strength of the men and the horses could not make the wheels budge an inch, the general began to suspect supernatural forces at work. Cackling laughter from a nearby bush alerted the ghost hunters to the presence of the Bell Witch. The entity welcomed the party, then uttered a command that unfroze the wheels of the coach. That night, in spite their previous boasts of easy conquest, the witch layer and then the ghost layers fled in terror when the witch attacked them. According to the accounts of the incident, General Jackson told John Bell that fighting the witch was tougher than facing the British at the Battle of New Orleans. Although Jackson had planned to stay until the ghost had been vanquished, because his army of ghost chasers had admitted defeat, he decided to leave with his men. Betsy had no choice but to give in to the witch's demands and to break her engagement to Joshua. With Betsy's marriage plans terminated, the ghost began again to concentrate its energy on the destruction of John Bell. Richard was walking with his father when John Bell collapsed into a spasmodic, convulsing heap. Young Richard was terrified by the agonies that beset his father, and he wrote later that his facial contortions were so hideous that they seemed to transform him into, quote, a very demon to swallow me up. John Bell was brought home to his bed, where he laid for several days in a very weakened condition. During the man's illness, the cruel entity would not leave him in peace, but continued to torment him by slapping his face and throwing his legs into the air. On the morning of December 19th, 1820, John Bell lapsed into a stupor. John Jr. went quickly to the medicine cabinet to obtain his father's prescription and found instead a smoky-looking vial which was about 1/3 full of dark-colored liquid. The witch cackled that it was no use to try to revive old Jack. She had him at last. When John Jr. demanded to know where the vial came from, the witch answered smugly that it had placed the vial in the medicine cabinet that night. "I gave old Jack a big dose of it while he slept. I fixed him," the entity laughed. John Jr. sent for the doctor. When the physician arrived, he asked one of the boys to fetch a cat from the barn. While John Jr. held the cat, the doctor dipped a straw into the dark vial and wiped it on the animal's tongue. The cat jumped into the air, whirled about the floor, and died quickly. And sure enough, John Bell passed away, never rousing from his unconscious state. The witch sang bawdy songs during John Bell's funeral and annoyed the assembled mourners with the sound of crude celebration during the last rites. The witch behaved much better towards Betsy after the death of her father, and never again inflicted pain on the young woman and even began to address her in terms of endearment. The psychic energy which had nurtured the ghost appeared to be waning. During the rest of the winter and into the spring months, the manifestations decreased steadily. Then, one night after an evening meal, a large smoke ball appeared to roll out of the chimney of the fireplace and into the room. As it exploded, a voice told the family, "I am going now. I will be gone for 7 years." True to its promise, the witch returned to the Bell homestead in 1828. Betsy had entered into a successful marriage with another man. John Jr. had married and now farmed land of his own. Only Mrs. Bell, Joel, and Richard remained at the family home. But the disturbances during the ghost's second appearance consisted only of scratching and pulling the covers off the bed. The members of the Bell family agreed to ignore the unwanted guest. Their psychology worked, and the witch left them after 2 weeks of pestering them for attention. But before it did, the entity sought out John Jr. and told him it would return to one of his descendants in, quote, 100 years and 7. Dr. Charles Bailey Bell should have been the recipient of the witch's unwelcome return visit, but Dr. Bell and his family survived the year of 1935 without hearing the slightest unexplained scratch or rapping. Dr. Bell wrote the official record of the mystifying disturbances endured by his ancestors in the book A Mysterious Spirit, The Bell Witch of Tennessee. Dr. Bell also made note of the precognitive powers of the witch, who revealed a series of, quote, wonderful things and prophecies to his grandfather. According to Dr. Bell, the witch predicted the Civil War, the emancipation of the slaves, the acceleration of the United States as a world power, the 2 world wars, and destruction of our civilization by, quote, rapidly expanding heat, followed by a mighty explosion. The date of the prediction of the end of the world was not given. Today, the land where the abandoned cabin of the John Bell family stood is owned by a private trust, and visitors are not allowed to explore the property. The only site associated with the Bell Witch that remains open to the public is the nearby Bell Witch Cave.
Yeah.
You want to go?
Bell Witch. No. No.
No.
Where do you even start with this one?
No.
This one's crazy.
Yeah. This spooky story, it just really gets to me because of all the commonalities it has with other poltergeist elements that we've learned about, like the throwing of stones in the Zimbabwe goblin entity incidents and the learning to speak, like the Jiff Weasel story. And there seems to be this common thread of collective belief and a building of attention. But to what end and why with all these different stories? What do they all want to accumulate to? This one seems to have a bit of a conclusion.
What's behind the entities? Yeah. What are they? So they're accumulating the energy and they're getting stronger. Well, in this case, I guess the Bell Witch did what she wanted to do, which is murder.
Right. But some of these, they just kind of fade away or you're not quite sure.
Right. There's all this noise and all this terror.
Energy, yeah.
And then it just sort of like slowly dissipates. And so why? What was the point is what you're saying.
Like why build it up if it's just going to fade off anyway? And then like what are the elements that we're not seeing here that are kind of bringing it all together? Like maybe
it's a paranormal theater. There's an audience somewhere in another dimension and the judges.
And we happen to have really good EMFs to boost the signal and you just don't know.
Makes sense when you realize it's just all a paranormal game show in another dimension. Yeah, I really love the way the events and the hauntings in this story just keep escalating. It's just completely bonkers the way it does. And really, for me, the entity's raucous, drunken cronies, Black Dog, mathematics, typography, and Jerusalem, that's just right out of a Tom Waits song right there.
I love it.
The details of the bananas and hazelnuts, I think, also are just fascinating. And the whole scenario with Andrew Jackson and his men,
Right.
That's just incredible.
Right.
That's cred.
Right.
I mean, we're just bringing in some big names in this ghost story.
Right. That witnessed it. And you're right about the hazelnuts. Like, how do you orchestrate that if it isn't paranormal, if that really did happen?
Yeah, exactly. And to that line of thought, the Bell Witch case is one of those extraordinary, well-documented cases with oodles of sworn witnesses and special guest stars.
Who may happen to be on money.
Exactly. And it's the type of story where skeptics have to go to lengths far more ridiculous than a belief in supernatural entities in order to explain it away. It's like, it was a mass hallucination.
Right.
I love that old chestnut. When someone describes the science behind how a throng of people can all see the exact same thing at the exact same time without anyone having to discuss it. And this person sums up with how the thing that was witnessed was a figment of imagination and not really there. I mean, honestly, it's that person who's sounding like a complete wingnut, not the multiple witnesses to this extraordinary event.
Right. They would rather lie to themselves to such a point it's illogical than to accept something they just don't want to accept.
Right. That's just crazy. Not that we're harshing on science.
No,
we're
not at all.
harshing on the kind of person who says they are for science when actually they're
The science they like.
They're putting on the blinders. Yes, they're putting on blinders instead of actually moving forward with that true scientific spirit. Anyway, this story has always made me wonder about the karmic history between the entity and John Bell. I mean, obviously, there was a grudge.
Something.
But what was it? Was the entity a tulpa created by Kate Batts with whom he had the land dispute? I think that's very possible because it's interesting that there was a suspect and a sort of a witchy sort of phenomena that was happening, right down to the ball of smoke coming down the chimney. Remember the whole witch bottles where you hang them?
They clearly didn't have one in their hearth.
Exactly. Either way, he was bullied literally to death by a spirit. And thank goodness these kinds of stories are fewer and far between, right? Because
I don't know. Maybe people would behave better. I'm kidding.
I think you have a point.
Well, there you have it. The entirety of the 12 days of Christmas ghost stories.
How do we sum up all of that?
Oh, I know. Because we shared on day 12 a ghostly murder.
11 spooky slam doors.
10 barking ghost kid.
9 hag and crawl space.
8 graveyard freakouts.
7 shattered bottles.
6 DJ screaming.
5 pancake ghosts.
4 co-eds in clokes.
3 haunted carts.
2 outraged ghosts.
And an attack by a Ouija board.
Oh, God. We'll let ourselves out.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Odd Tonic.
Remember to write Odd Tonic a kind review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, CastBox, iHeartRadio, or Podchaser.com so other oddlings can find us too.
Visit us on YouTube, Facebook, and all the socials.
And we'll be back soon, we promise, with more weird history, strange science, and paranormal peculiarities.
This is, dear guest, goodbye for now. But remember, if you ever forget your breakfast to-go bag and double back into a creepy basement to find 2 dark, shadowy outlines eating your pancakes, don't worry.
It's just us.
Good night.